You're listening to IDC International Radio 106.2. I'm Dan Diker, and this is Counter Terrorism Today. The question that we're going to tackle, Syria, between terrorism and self-destruction. What is going to be the future of the Sunni majority state in a region that is also in a meltdown? We have a great panel today of leading experts in the region. We're going to tackle these questions. Professor Assaf Moghadam, who is the academic director of the ICT, the International Institute for Counterterrorism. Welcome. We have Brigadier General Nitzan Nuriel, who's the former head Prime Minister's counterterrorism desk in the Prime Minister's office, and today he is a senior fellow of the ICT, the International Institute for Counterterrorism, here at IDC Herzliya. And we have Mr. Bassem Eid, a well-known and widely respected Palestinian affairs analyst and the founder of the Palestinian Human Rights Monitoring Group, a long-time and well-known organization here in the area in Israel. And I'm Dan Diker. Let's get straight into it. Professor Moghadam, what is the real danger in Syria today? Is the real danger ISIS, the Islamic State? Is it Jabhat al-Nusra, the al-Qaeda branch in Syria? Is it Hezbollah, Iran, or is it the regime itself?
Well, Syria is, of course, it depends really on at which level you're looking at. So from a macro level, of course, from an Israeli perspective, any sort of long-term instability in Syria is a danger. My focus traditionally has been on terrorist organizations, so I can speak a bit to the dangers that are posed by the individual organizations. I think that if I can focus for a second on the jihadi organizations, ISIS and Jabhat al-Nusra. When it comes to Israel, I think that at present there is no immediate danger that's emanating from these jihadi groups, but the long-term threat is certainly there. I think that, first of all, if we can compare ISIS and Jabhat al-Nusra, they derive from a very similar ideology. Both ISIS and Jabhat al-Nusra have their roots in jihadi Salafist ideology. Where they differ is really in terms of their strategy. Right, so Jabhat al-Nusra is al-Qaeda's official affiliate in Syria. Its strategy is much, much more focused on the long term. Jabhat al-Nusra is extremely good at forming alliances with local groups. Right now, it's sitting actually along the Israeli border in the southwest, just near the Golan Heights. But for the moment, they're preoccupied with fighting actually a local insurgency. ISIS is also preoccupied right now with also trying to build and extend the caliphate in Syria and Iraq. At the moment, nobody has really a direct interest in stirring up trouble as far as Israel is concerned. In the long term, certainly, I think that Israel has always been and will always be part of one of the three main enemies of the jihadi movement. For the jihadi movement, the three main enemies have always been the Zionists, which is a shorthand for Israel and the Jews combined. The Crusaders, on the other hand, which are the Western nations led by the United States, and the local Arab regimes who are considered to be apostates by the jihadists. So Israel has always been, will always be one of the enemies for these groups. But for the moment, they're probably more busy trying to get rid of the Assad regime and trying to build their power in Syria.
I want to pick up on that point from Professor Moghadam. I want to move to Brigadier General Nuriel. Is there a balance of terror in Syria between Islamic State, Jabhat al-Nusra, Hezbollah, that will enable these groups to keep bloodletting, fighting each other, and essentially continuing this situation of what has become really a terror hell for some years to come?
From the Israeli perspective, we have one great mission to make sure that the Golan Heights will not be a border of terror. And it doesn't matter who is going to conduct it. It's Hezbollah, Jabhat al-Nusra, or ISIS. From the Israeli perspective, we have to make sure that anyone is trying to penetrate or launch terror attack along this border will be immediately responded by the Israeli Defense Forces, and therefore our current strategic is to make sure that we are strong enough in the Golan Heights, and we slowly build kind of security zone, meaning finding those who are living very close to the border that can cooperate with us based on common interest, and they do have many small communities along the Golan Heights that all they ask is to live in quiet and peace.
You mean on the other side of the Golan Heights, on the other side of the border,
yes. So,
on the Syrian side?
So I don't care if it's Hezbollah, Jabhat al-Nusra, or ISIS. Anyone who's
or the Druze.
No, I'm speaking about those who are trying to attack us. I can't see any scenario that the Druze are going to...
No, they would protect it, but they would be a protector of Israel on the other side.
From the Israeli perspective, anyone who is going to attack us from the Golan Heights is about to pay the price. Why? Because we cannot stand transfer the Golan Heights border from the quietest borders we had into a border which terror attack will be like a routine over there. This is something that we cannot accept.
Bassem Eid, answer this as a Middle Eastern Arab Muslim, not as a Palestinian intellectual as you are for a moment. What does the echo effect of the Syrian terror jigsaw puzzle mean for the Arab world? When they look at Syria from the outside, what are they seeing?
See, I think that the Arab world right now don't know exactly what's really going on in Syria. The only clear thing in Syria right now, that you have almost around 85 different terrorist and extremist groups who are fighting against each other, including, by the way, the Palestinians in the refugee camp of Al Yarmouk, including some militias which is belonging to the Hamas, which almost established recently in Al Yarmouk refugee camp, and nobody has an idea what's really going on in Syria and why these people are fighting. What is the main goal that each terror organization want to achieve right now? The problem is, in the other side, that the international community is still keeping a so blind eyes on what's going on in Syria. You want to tell me that the international community couldn't take one serious measure and put an end for such unbelievable destruction which is taking place inside Syria?
Does that surprise you, Brigadier General Nuriel? I mean, what Bassem Eid is saying really is that counterterrorism operations in Western countries have really done very little, if anything, by the way, led by the United States. So what is this? How is this playing out with your counterparts in the European and the Western counterterror agencies? Are basically people saying, let's just wait and see?
I think that we need to look into all the Middle East, not only in Syria, regarding that issue. I think that most of the coalition states, meaning the Western world, decided that they are not going to interfere. They are not going to take any major role. It doesn't matter if it's in Iraq, Yemen, Libya, or Syria. And the main reason for that brings me into some religious point. Right now, what we are watching in the Arab world, it's the huge friction between the Shia and the Sunni. And if you take any side, that means that you decided which side should lead the Muslim world. And I don't think that anyone from the Western states is about to take decisions like that. So they are going to fight like it was between Iraq and Iran during the war with them. 8 years of war, 1 million of casualties, and I can't see right now any mechanism that will interfere and try to put some order on that system. Professor
Moghadam, before I come back to Bassem Eid, because I know he wants to do a follow-up here, what is your sense as a scholar who grew up in the West, in Europe and in the United States, about whether the West really has any idea of the difference between Shia and Sunni when it comes to these conflicts? I mean, perhaps you're saying, we don't know who the good guys and the bad guys are, so the heck with it, let's just stay out of it, as opposed to the ideology that Brigadier General Nuriel is talking about.
I think that Europeans are not really very well aware of the actual differences, the sectarian tensions that are prevalent in the Middle East. I think that the same applies actually also for Americans. I think that also to follow up on Brigadier General Nitzan Nuriel's answer, I agree. And I think that there's also, in addition to that, a certain fatigue of Europe, of the West, when it comes to war. Europe, of course, hasn't really been fighting an actual war since World War II. has not been really involved heavily in any war. The United States has been involved in a variety of insurgencies over the last decades, and there's clearly a fatigue also. I think that there is also in Europe a certain belief that the problem is just going to go away by itself. I think that the big issue which is going to change that equation is that there are sooner or later there are going to be more foreign fighters who are going to return from Syria and other places and who will conduct terrorist attacks in Europe. It has happened already to some extent. We've seen the attack against the Jewish Museum in Brussels, which has been carried out by a former foreign fighter. These attacks, unfortunately, are going to pick up, and so sooner or later, I think that Europeans are going to wake up, or they will have to wake up to see that there is actually a problem in the Middle East which does affect them.
Bassem Eid, what was your follow-up comment here?
Yeah, in addition, of course, to all of our criticism towards the international community, I think that also let us look to the Arab countries, what the Arabs are doing for the Arabs. These Arab countries, which used to be represented by the Arab League, the so-called Arab League, which unfortunately in the past 3 years looks like that the Arab League itself became as a rehabilitation center for handicapped people. I want to see those Arab leaders right now, especially in the Gulf, how they can change the situation. I couldn't understand it. How the Arab leaders right now are sitting on their chairs and calling for the UN to put out a kind of solutions to the crisis in Syria. How that could be?
Well, here we go. This is, I would call it a really headline moment. Bassem Eid saying that the Arab League has become a center for handicapped people. That's quite a statement. I mean, that's quite an observation. Gentlemen, we want to move from this first section quickly as it went for the first 10 minutes, from the infrastructure, from the architecture of Sunni and Shia groups, terror groups in Syria. We want to move to the next segment. Our next segment is going to be on Western and Israeli security policy. I want to turn to Brigadier General Nuriel and ask him, does Israel have a strategy for dealing with the terrorism on its northern neighbor? Is there a counterterrorism strategy, or is there really tactics and grand tactics?
I think that we have to define between Hezbollah in Lebanon and what's happening in Syria. In Lebanon, the main Israeli concept is to build up on deterrence. The bad news with deterrence is that when it's gone, it's too late. And the question is, how can you keep the deterrence in a way which the enemy, in that case Hezbollah, will think twice or 3 times before he are launching any type of attack?
We're talking about deterrence. How do you maintain deterrence?
That's right. I'm saying that it's a huge challenge to make sure that Hezbollah will not even think about launching a terror attack against Israelis or Jewish targets or Jewish communities. If you ask me, the Third Lebanon War, it's only a question of time.
Third Lebanon War, a question of time, a question of deterrence. Professor Moghadam, from the point of view of the DNA of Salafi terror groups and even Hezbollah, is deterrence a concept that even works when you talk about if you talk about messianic groups such as the Hezbollah and radical Shiite eschatology, or if you talk about the super radical extremist Sunni, the Salafi groups, is deterrence even worth talking about?
Not deterrence in the traditional sense of the word, which I've done a lot of research on suicide bombings, and so we know, of course, that there's an abundance of people from within the jihadi movement who are willing to sacrifice themselves. So I think that the traditional idea of deterrence does not really apply to the jihadists. I do think that, of course, that doesn't mean that the deterrence is outdated. I just think that it has its limitations. I think that one of the problems when we talk about the Israeli strategy against terrorism is actually a problem of really understanding these groups for what they are. And here I would say that I personally am not a big fan of looking at these groups as terrorist groups only. Of course, they're terrorist organizations as they conduct acts of terrorism. But I think that we also have to recognize that these groups do much, much more beyond terrorism. And here, these groups have evolved into insurgent actors, right? These are groups that have become militias, that have fighting capabilities, which for some groups actually amount to the same capacities and more capacities than some states have in the region, like Hezbollah. And so when we look at the strategy, when we're trying to define a counterterrorism strategy, we actually have to start by recognizing that these groups are not terrorist organizations in the strict sense of the word. They are terrorist organizations, but they're much more than that, right? They are political actors. They are insurgent actors who are fighting regular standing armies more often than they actually conduct terrorist attacks. So any strategy that we have to devise will have to take account of these very, very complex developments.
One of the things, one of the words that was not mentioned but very much read into what you've just said, Professor Moghadam, is the semi-legitimacy of insurgent and terrorism actors for their social and charitable activities. Hezbollah, Hamas in the south, and even even ISIS. I mean, ISIS is a major corporation, and it provides salaries to thousands of people. From your point of view, Bassem Eid, from a Middle Eastern point of view, what is the West not understanding about these Islamic groups from a cultural standpoint?
See, I think that the Western countries should have to be accused on what's going on right now in the Middle East, because in my opinion, all these fundamentalist terrorist groups almost developed during the dictatorship time, which has been supported by the Western countries in the Middle East. These people has been totally oppressed by their own leaders. And that's probably one of the main reasons why is such kind of people moved so right, so in very difficult minds, that it probably almost created such kind of a huge terror right now in the Middle East. On the other side, if you will ask the Western countries how you can deal with that right now and to solve it, I don't think that they have any kind of strategy right now. And this is how things are growing on right now. And looks like that these terrorists also succeed in the past probably 2 years to create a kind of cooperation among themselves. You couldn't believe that the Salafis right now are fighting the Hamas in Gaza, and the ISIS in Halab in Syria is still threatening the Hamas that one day we will come and we will occupy you. So it is an Islamist people, it is Sunnis people, but they are still fighting each other, which nobody can understand what is exactly the background.
You know, I want to pick up on what Bassem Eid is saying, Brigadier General Nuriel, and talk about the problem of the growing legitimacy of terror organizations, and we'll take Syria as a great microcosm. You know, when the Bashar Assad regime that controls now 20% of Syria, probably just in Al-Awazstan, as General Amos Gilad said just the other day, they are considered legitimate. They're a UN member. And then again, when you opposite them and you have these different terror groups that are also semi-political organizations, as Professor Moghadam said, they become, in the eyes of the international community, even more legitimate. Does that make it more difficult to fight against them? Is this growing international legitimacy? Perhaps not for ISIS, but, well, about some in the West, ISIS, yes, but these other groups are gaining a similar type of legitimacy to the Assad regime. Does it make it tougher to fight the counterterrorism battle?
I think, generally speaking, that right now in Syria, no one really have any type of legitimacy. So what I'm saying is that this is an issue that we are speaking about, but it's not really real. Mm-hmm. It's not really something that somebody take under his consideration. And from the Israeli perspective, as well as from the Western perspective, each of the parties belong to the bad guys. Therefore, it's very tough to find the good guys in order to increase their capabilities, so they will take the lead.
On the other hand, we did have, a situation where U.S. President Barack Obama did a 180-degree turn from one evening to the next morning, in my view, affording some legitimacy to the Bashar Assad regime, and that they invited Russia in to take care of the chemical weapons problem, and that was sort of agreed by the international community. Doesn't that increase sort of the legitimacy of the regime in the sense that they willfully gave up, so to speak, their chemical weapons arsenal, even though we know between us at this table that there's still chemical weapons in Syria?
I think that it was a kind of a mechanism to solve a very specific problem. I don't think that the United States wants Russia to take responsibility on Syria. I don't think that anyone really believes that Turkey can take responsibility on Syria. So they have to solve the problem by themselves. It will take time. And if you ask me, in the next 5 to 10 years, nothing dramatically will be changed in Syria.
Professor Moghadam, let's look at some of the other groups in Syria, the more moderate groups. Is there a chance for, and this is actually a question for Nitzan, Nuriel as well, and Bassem, is there any chance for what is known as the moderate groups, so-called moderate, it's a tough word to use these days, for the elements of the Free Syrian Army, the Druze, the Kurds, that they could create some sort of economy of scale, some sort of beachhead as organizations, and actually assert themselves among these terror groups? Can they deter terror groups, in your view?
I think that one of the big ironies also when we talk about strategy on the part of the West is that we probably missed the perfect timing for when we could have really supported what we call the moderate opposition. I think that if we would have done that earlier on in the civil war, that would have been a much better strategy in hindsight. One of the big problems with the moderate opposition right now is, first of all, well, as you said, it's the word moderate is very problematic here, but the bigger problem really is the huge appeal that the Islamists and the jihadists, especially the jihadist groups, still have, not only in the local population, but also as we know, right, there's an influx of foreign fighter, about 20,000 foreign fighters who are coming. And joining not only ISIS, by the way, but the variety of the jihadi groups. Another big problem that the moderate opposition has to contend with is that the jihadi groups are actually much better funded than many of the moderate groups. So at least when we look at ISIS, for example, ISIS is certainly the best funded organization, terrorist organization, perhaps in history. But Jabhat al-Nusra actually also is quite well funded, albeit through other means, but they receive a lot of money from Gulf donors, from Saudi Arabia. ISIS is able to generate a lot of funding on its own through the sale of antiquities, of course through the sale of oil, by levying taxes locally where they rule. So the moderate opposition is actually up against a very capable enemy and a very well-funded enemy.
See, this is a very important point I want to pick up and ask the final question of this segment to Brigadier General Nuriel, and that is that, you take ISIS has become sort of a semi-state multinational corporation, and that, in my view, would require a political military strategy of free states, neighboring states, the West, in approaching what originally seemed to be called a conventional terror problem, and now is much more complex because there are political and diplomatic elements in a sort of a political warfare strategy, if you will, as part of the counter-terror strategy. So the question is, Brigadier General, how does Israel think about this? This is a new phenomenon for Israel to sort of incorporate a political and military counterterrorism strategy in an integrated whole. Does it struggle with this idea?
Generally speaking, we don't think that Daesh is something that is in the top of our list. I mean, we need to protect our borders. I mean, we need to make sure that they are not getting any advantages regarding Jordan, for example. And if they do, to take some actions in order to prevent it. But I think that if we really want to shut down ISIS, which is something that's achievable, all we have to do is to decide to destroy all the fuel chain, meaning destroy the oil industrial, destroy all those trucks that deliver the oil, which create the finance issues. And by that, within 10 days, ISIS will be shut down because he will not be able to move. And if he cannot move, then all the increasing of the Daesh state will stop.
Well, you might want to pass that secret on to the Western powers that haven't succeeded to do that yet. But it seems to be a good strategy.
It's question of decision. It's not question of capabilities. If someone in the Western world may decide to do so, they can do it. From the operational point of view, it's very easy to conduct.
Well, there you have it. Shut down the oil lines, Bassem Eid. That sounds pretty reasonable. What we're going to do here, we're going to move now from the operational strategies and tactics of Israel and its neighbors, and we're going to move to yet another segment, which is going to be on. Let's look at the Palestinians for a second. The Syrians have been the let's call it the flag, the major flag, the rallying point for the Palestinian national movement for so many years. And all of a sudden, we've gone from sort of a Palestinian national movement to revolutionary movements, where Hamas has become sort of the leader of the Palestinian revolutionary movement to its fellow travelers in radical Islam. How does from a Palestinian point of view, look at Syria today? What do the Palestinians see, both inside Syria in the refugee camps and outside?
I think that the relationship between the Palestinians and the Syrians almost broken since the beginning, I guess, of the civil war, which started since 4 years ago in Syria. And probably Syrian were much more closer to the Hamas rather than to the Fatah, rather than to Arafat, rather than to Mahmoud Abbas. Because the only one who can probably be applicable for the Syrian agenda is the Hamas rather than the Fatah.
Even though the other PLO groups, such as the PFLP and PFLP General Command, they've been there for years and years.
I don't consider these people as fighters. I think that these people are traitors to the regime of Syria, and because the Syrian regime, who used to finance is such kind of people like Naif Hawatmi, like Ahmad Jibreen, which is, by the way, Ahmad Jibreen is the one who started the internal war in the Al Yarmouk refugee camp recently, because his thugs and his gangsters start shooting from inside the camp against the Syrian opposition. And this is how the whole issue has been exploded inside the Al Yarmouk refugee camp. Now, I don't think that the Hamas right now is so satisfied from the policy of the Syrian regime towards the Palestinian refugees. And just recently I hear that the Hamas also start funding their own militiot inside the refugee camp to fight against the ISIS, but in the meantime also against the regime itself, which I couldn't understand how the Iranian can really get closer and closer for these two dictators, which is the Hamas and Bashar al-Assad, which they used to be so friendly, but unfortunately they are fighting each other, specifically in the refugee camp.
Brigadier General Nuriel, when you think about what Bassem Eid is saying, it looks like Syria has become a much weaker platform for the Iranian regime than it ever has been before, and not the opposite.
Of course, therefore they invest Hezbollah and invest other assets in order to keep the regime, because the alternative, from the Iranian point of view, it's worse.
So why is it so bad? In other words, if the Iranians are as strong as they say they are, why does the whole place look like a big pile of what in the Middle East? And why doesn't the IRGC, the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, under the direct command of the Ayatollah, come in and just kill the enemy and retake Syria?
I believe that this is a very good question, which we will see in the next future what will be the decisions in Iran. I personally believe that the Iranian will not send the Revolutionary Guards to Syria, mainly because they're afraid from the results.
Afraid from the results. Professor Moghadam, how do you see it?
Well, I would defer and actually agree with my colleague. I believe that if we look at the Iran for the last 2 decades, 3 decades since the revolution, 3.5 decades, it has really become a specialist when it comes to interfering, meddling in foreign countries without really paying a very, very heavy price. Right, so it's been using the IRGC, and the Al-Quds force within the IRGC to stir trouble in many, many regions, most recently Syria and also Yemen, for example. But when it comes to doing the actual fighting, the Iranians have never really paid the blood money, so to speak, a blood price for these fights. When it comes to the IRGC, also, I think it's important to mention that the IRGC does not really have any battle experience. Right, the Iranians are much more used to using Hezbollah to do the dirty work for them.
So let's take a look at the Hezbollah right now, and take a look at them on the Shiite on the radical Shiite side versus the Sunni insurgencies. Who does it look like to you is going to come out on top? Is there a way of creating scenarios for the future, in your view, the way things are going? I know that you in your own work, Professor, have talked about Jabhat al-Nusra as being the group with the strong biceps.
Yeah. So I think that Hezbollah has one big problem that Hezbollah has in Syria is that it's fighting basically somebody else's war. It doesn't really have a very strong stake, other than it, of course, being at the being very heavily influenced on the part of the Iranians. ISIS and Jabhat al-Nusra, in my opinion, they have a stronger stake actually in Syria. They view Syria as, in the case of ISIS, of course, they have established the caliphate in Syria and in Iraq. Jabhat al-Nusra has been, in recent years, portraying itself as a much more organic organization. It has amassed more fighters that are actually from Syria, because Jabhat al-Nusra was originally created as a splinter organization from Al-Qaeda in Iraq. But ever since, it has tried to portray itself as a Syrian organic organization. And so Jabhat al-Nusra has become more independent in that regard, even though it's officially an Al-Qaeda affiliate. There's also a big chance that Jabhat al-Nusra, I believe, is going to become an independent organization, that it's going to come to the conclusion that being an Al-Qaeda affiliate is not really producing any dividends for itself. So I believe that when we look at the long term, the militant jihadi groups have the upper hand. When it comes to looking at ISIS versus Jabhat al-Nusra, I think that their strategy, ISIS' strategy, is one of shock and awe, whereas Jabhat al-Nusra has a strategy of actually working underneath the radar, building alliances that are stronger, I believe, than the alliances that ISIS builds. Right? ISIS builds a lot of coalitions and alliances based on intimidation and based on fear and based on its recent military successes. But Jabhat al-Nusra actually also had very important military successes in the last 6 months. Actually, more geographic. They actually acquired more geographic territory in Syria than ISIS. But it works underneath the radar. It doesn't really advertise its victories as well as ISIS does. But I think it's a very important threat looking long term.
You know, gentlemen, when we talk about the threats and the competition between jihadi groups, this really represents, and it's very important, I think, to talk about this particular point on counterterrorism today. There's a real counterterrorism paradigm shift going on in the Middle East today, where for so many years the Palestinian issue as a combined problem, taking PLO, Fatah-led PLO, and Hamas as sort of some sort of joint group being the major terror problem, not only for Israel, but in the minds of the West, for the entire region and the free world. So you have to solve the Palestinian problem in order to bring peace in the Middle East. I think one of the issues we've laid out at this roundtable, which seems more and more obvious, is that the Palestinian issue as a terrorism-political issue has become somewhat of a footnote in the context of the Middle East. What do you think from your point of view, Brigadier General Nuriel?
I'm not a politician and I don't want to touch politics, but if I can advise the Palestinians, I would tell them that according to what's happening in the Middle East, they should understand that the only state that really takes care about them is the state of Israel. They cannot count on any other states. Lebanon, which is not a state, Syria, which is not a state, even the Gulf states, even Egypt. So if they want to take care about themselves, they need to approach the Israelis and find the right mechanism, the right formula, how to finalize, or at least how to start finalize the conflict between the Israelis and the Palestinians.
Well, you know, General, you can even take your comments and make them completely in the context of counterterrorism. There's no other, it seems there's no other counterterrorism, no other security anchor for the Palestinians than the State of Israel, leaving politics aside.
The level of cooperation between the Israelis today and the Palestinian security forces in Judah and Samaria is very good. And the main reason for that is not because they decided to participate to the Zionist movement, because they understand that the alternative, meaning the Hamas taking over Judah and Samaria, is much more worse for them than anything else.
Bassem Eid, how do you see it from your standpoint, having grown up in the refugee camps of East Jerusalem and having you wander and visit through the West Bank, former West Bank of Jordan, what's called, we understand Israel's Judea and Samaria, every day?
I think that the Palestinians almost realized that probably the Israel and the West Bank, and I can include Gaza also, it's probably the only stable area right now in the Middle East. If you will go today to the West Bank, I think that people are really aware on what's going on around us, what's going on in Sinai right now, what's going on in Yemen, what's going on in Syria. And people, I think that the people a little bit afraid also that probably one day they will be falling, in such kind of areas. But on the other side, I think that the people are quite sure that is such kind of quiet on the security basics here between the Israelis and the Palestinians, that's probably will benefit the Palestinians even much more than the Israelis. And this is probably one of the reasons why we have, as we heard, a full cooperation right now between the Palestinian security forces and the Israeli security forces. I think that Abbas right now probably he is also a little bit afraid that his empire in the West Bank might be occupied by the Hamas. And this is one of the reasons why Abbas in the past few days, after the 4 shooting incidents in the West Bank, Abbas security forces almost arrested around 130 members of the Hamas in the West Bank, mainly in the Hebron area, by the way. So Abbas is aware that Islam is just increasing and spreading, and Abbas don't want to see any Hamas member right now in the West Bank.
Well, there you have it. From a cauldron of terror, and hopefully at some point to an anchor of stability. This is the Middle East as we have it today, and I guess fortunately we're sitting here in Israel, which is really the anchor of stability for the entire Middle East, and it gives us the opportunity and the privilege to talk about counterterrorism today, in freedom, in democracy, and in stability. I want to thank each one of you, our expert panelists, Professor Assaf Moghadam, the academic director of the International Institute for Counterterrorism, right here at the Interdisciplinary Center, Herzliya. Brigadier General Nitzan Nuriel is the former head of the Prime Minister's Desk on Counterterrorism and a distinguished fellow here at the International Center for Counterterrorism. And, of course, Bassem Eid, the Palestinian Arab Affairs analyst at Voice of Israel, as well as the founder of the Palestinian Human Rights Monitoring Group. Gentlemen, this has been Counterterrorism Today. We thank you very much for your insights, and we'll look forward to having you back soon for more discussion about this turbulent region in which we live. Thank you all very much for joining us.